I'm Harper Morgan, and for as long as I can remember, my parents have said my brother would always outshine me. But when the CEO called me ma'am in front of everyone, their stunned faces told a different story. This isn't just about proving them wrong, it's about finding my own voice. Stay with me, because this story might remind you that your worth doesn't depend on anyone else's expectations. I hadn't driven this winding stretch of highway in over 6 years. The familiar Oregon landscape, tall pines, low clouds, the faint tang of wood smoke in the air, felt like both a welcome and a warning. I kept my eyes on the road ahead, my fingers gripping the steering wheel with a steadiness I'd honed through years of disciplined training. Even though this trip was personal, I found myself sitting ramrod straight, every breath deliberate, every muscle taut. I was coming home, not just to the white-clapboard house where I'd grown up, but to the weight of unspoken comparisons that had always been waiting for me there. I could almost hear my father's voice in my head already, that dry tone he used when he introduced my brother at dinner parties. Noah's our shining star. Could have done anything he wanted. Corporate, military, you name it. It was a line I'd memorized, one that always made me feel like I was standing in someone else's shadow, no matter how far I'd come. Noah Morgan, 38 vice president at Pinnacle Core Technologies, the son who never seemed to falter, never missed a chance to dazzle our parents. His life had been an endless string of highlight reels, first in his class, first to land a high-paying job, first to build a picture-perfect life. In our parents' eyes, Noah was the kind of man who would have excelled at anything. Even they liked to suggest if he had chosen my path in the military. I'd heard it more than once over the years. If Noah had worn the uniform, he would have been a general by now, my father would say with a shrug, half serious, half a challenge. It was never said to wound, but it always left a mark. I knew exactly how these conversations would go tonight. Noah's new business deal, Noah's latest promotion, Noah's perfect marriage. And me? I'd be there too, of course. A quiet presence in the corner, a polite smile masking the ache that had taken root years ago. As I turned onto the gravel driveway, I exhaled slowly, pushing down the flicker of old resentment that tried to rise. The house looked the same. White paint, a little more faded, the wind chime by the door singing a thin tune in the breeze. I let the engine idle for a moment, taking in the sight of my childhood home, the place that had taught me resilience, even if it had never offered me full acceptance. For a brief second, I considered turning around, driving back to the calm predictability of my apartment in Washington, D.C., but I had faced down boardrooms and war rooms alike. I wouldn't flinch from this. I was here for the family dinner, yes, but more importantly, I was here for the meeting that would follow tomorrow, and that was mine alone. I stepped out into the crisp dusk air, my breath clouding in the cold. I wore civilian clothes for now. No need to announce myself just yet. My uniform was neatly folded in my overnight bag, its brass buttons polished to a quiet gleam, a promise to myself tonight I would listen. Tomorrow I would be heard. My mother opened the door before I could knock. She still looked every bit the image of domestic warmth, with a dish towel draped over one shoulder and a faint smile playing at her lips. But that smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Harper," she said, voice tinged with mild surprise. "You're here." "I'm here," I replied evenly, returning the smile with practiced calm. Inside the house smelled like pot roast and cinnamon candles. Comforting, familiar, almost enough to make me forget why I'd stayed away so long. The walls were lined with family photos. In every one, Noah's easy grin was front and center. Noah's graduation. Noah's first big deal. Noah's wedding to a woman so perfect she seemed plucked from a catalog. My own achievements. My military milestones were there too, but pushed to the side frames, so small they were almost apologetic. In the dining room, my father looked up from the sports page, offering me a distracted nod. "Made good time," he said. "Noah's already here. He's been filling us in on the new project. Biggest one yet. CEO's coming in tomorrow for it. Of course he was. Noah always had something important to share. That's great, I said softly, my tone polite neutral. I knew better than to interrupt the rhythm of these conversations. My mother moved past me, calling back over her shoulder as she disappeared into the kitchen. You must be tired from the drive, Noah was saying just the other day. If he'd joined the military instead of the company, he'd probably be a general by now. He's just got that drive in him. The words were tossed out carelessly, but they landed like stones in my chest. I didn't reply. Some remarks were so familiar they barely stung anymore. As I made my way down the narrow hallway, I let my fingertips brush along the worn wooden banister, grounding myself in the feel of something solid, something real. In this house, it had always been easier to measure worth in titles and salaries, in Noah's steady climb up the corporate ladder. I had learned to stop seeking validation there long ago. I carried my own worth now, in the discipline of my posture, in the quiet certainty of my mission, in the knowledge that tomorrow my voice would be the one that mattered. Tonight, I would sit at their table. I would listen to them talk about Noah's next move, and I would let them believe whatever they wanted to believe about me. But in the morning, the world they thought they knew would shift, and I would be there to hold that moment in the palm of my hand, steady and unshaken. Dinner that night was every bit as I remembered, warm in color, cozy in appearance, but heavy with an invisible weight that had followed me since childhood. We sat around the familiar wooden table, the one with the small burn mark from a candle I'd knocked over when I was 12. My mother, Elaine, had set it beautifully as always, the same floral tablecloth and flickering candles that made the meal look like something out of a magazine. But it wasn't the meal I was thinking about. It was the way the conversation unfolded, the same script I had known for years. Noah had arrived before me, of course, and he was already halfway through an animated story about the upcoming project his team was handling. My mother was positively glowing, hanging on his every word like she was listening to a visiting dignitary. Her eyes sparkled in a way they never did when I spoke about my work. Noah, tell us again about that conference in Denver, she said, spoon poised over her plate. It sounded so impressive. And the CEO, Charlotte Grant, she's the one flying in tomorrow, right? He nodded, flashing the kind of easy smile that always seemed to come so naturally to him. Yes, she's overseeing the final approvals for the project. It's a huge opportunity, Mom. This could put my division in the spotlight for years to come. That's wonderful, dear, she murmured. Charlotte Grant must be an incredible leader. You're so fortunate to have her attention. She paused, glancing at me briefly before turning back to him. Are you thinking of asking her to mentor you? Maybe I busied myself with cutting a slice of pot roast, careful to keep my face neutral. It wasn't lost on me that she'd called the CEO by name, even though she had never once mentioned mine in relation to the work I did. I could have told her that I'd been in meetings with Charlotte Grant for months, now that tomorrow's visit had more to do with my own work than Noah's. But I didn't. Some truths didn't need to be spoken. At least not tonight. My father, James, leaned back in his chair, folding his hands across his stomach as he listened. His gaze flicked over me once cool and assessing before settling back on Noah with a faint smile of pride. Noah's always been the one who could handle pressure. He said his tone light but firm, always looking for the next challenge even when he was a kid. I wouldn't be surprised if he ended up running the entire company one day. Noah gave a modest shrug, but there was no denying the small smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. I just try to stay ahead of the curve, he said. You know how it is. My father chuckled. If you'd joined the military like your sister, you probably would have been a general by now. No doubt about it. The words dropped into the quiet like a stone. My fork paused in midair, though I didn't let it show in my expression. Noah didn't protest or deflect. He just grinned, almost as if to say, of course I would have been. Of course I'd be better at it than you. I focused on my plate, feeling the old ache bloom in my chest. It was an ache I had long since grown used to. a dull, familiar sting whenever my family decided to measure my life by comparing it to Noah's, even in spaces they'd never stepped into. I'd spent years fighting for every inch of respect in my field. But at this table, it always came back to the same question. Could he have done it better? I didn't argue. I didn't roll my eyes or remind them that rank isn't given because of potential, or that in the military you don't get ahead on charm alone. Instead, I chewed a piece of roast that tasted like cardboard and forced a small smile. "That's great, Noah," I said softly, my voice smooth and even. "I'm glad you're getting the chance to show what you can do." My mother beamed at me as if I'd finally said something right. "It's good to see you supporting each other," she said. "Families should always have each other's backs." I looked at her at the soft lines around her eyes and the way she still clutched her napkin like a shield. Part of me wanted to ask if she'd ever truly seen me, if she'd ever seen past Noah's shine long enough to notice my steady, quiet climb. But I let it go. Tonight wasn't for that. The conversation drifted to Noah's plans for a ski trip in Tahoe next winter, to the new restaurant he and his wife wanted to try downtown. My father's voice was warm and full of pride, and my mother's laughter rang out clear and bright. I kept my smile in place, nodding when it seemed expected, though my mind was already somewhere else. Outside the window, the Oregon night had wrapped the world in a thick fog, the kind that swallowed the light of the moon and made the air feel heavy and secret. I watched the mist curl around the edges of the glass, soft and relentless. It felt like a promise and a challenge all at once. Tomorrow they would see me for who I truly was. Tomorrow the fog would lift, and I would stand there unshaken with no more room left for comparisons. I let that thought settle into my chest like a slow breath, steady and sure. Tonight they could have their easy assumptions. Tomorrow belonged to me. I pushed the bedroom door open and stepped into a place that felt both achingly familiar and strangely distant. The same cream-colored curtains, the same wooden dresser I'd used for my entire childhood. Everything was as it had been, down to the row of academic awards and debate trophies carefully arranged on the shelf above my desk. They were dusty now, like relics of a time when my worth was measured in letter grades and perfect attendance. I ran my hand along the top edge of one trophy, feeling the faint ridges of my name etched in brass. But there were no photos of me in uniform, no pictures of the day I was commissioned, or the nights I spent in briefing rooms, the days and weeks I spent halfway across the world. My achievements in the military were invisible here. It was as if those years, those hard, grueling, beautiful years, existed in a world that my family had chosen not to see. I sat down on the edge of the bed, the old quilt creasing beneath me. The weight of the day pressed on my shoulders, but I held it in the way I'd learned to do so long ago. A quiet inhale, a slow exhale. Outside the window, the mist had thickened into a heavy curtain that blurred the shapes of the pines in the distance. I thought of the day I'd pinned on my lieutenant colonel insignia. The memory felt fresh, even though it had been months. I remembered the feel of the metal against my collar, the soft, steady voice of my commanding officer as she looked me in the eye and said, "Harper, you don't need the spotlight. You just need to walk in and own the room." That was the moment I had learned to stop shrinking myself to fit into the spaces other people had designed for me. It was the moment I realized that my value didn't come from their approval or from the easy comparisons they loved to make. It came from the years of quiet dedication, the countless hours of work no one else would ever see, the sacrifices that had become part of who I was. No one from my family had been there that day. There had been excuses, of course. Noah's big meeting, my mother's garden club, my father's work trip. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself that my pride didn't need witnesses, but a small part of me, the part that still wanted to be seen by them, had felt that absence like a bruise. I stood up and reached for the garment bag I'd brought with me, carefully unzipping it to reveal the uniform inside. Midnight blue, every brass button catching the soft light of the bedside lamp. I laid it out on the bed, smoothing the sleeves with a practiced hand. My fingers traced each button, each insignia, every sign of the rank I had earned. There was a calm to the ritual, an order and precision that had always steadied me. I polished the buttons one by one, letting the quiet fill the room. I thought of the woman in the mirror, the one who had stood in front of generals and boardrooms and never wavered. That was who I was bringing to the table tomorrow. Not the quiet daughter they barely noticed, not the sister overshadowed by Noah's endless charm. When I finally looked up, I caught my reflection in the mirror across from the bed. For a moment, I didn't see the girl who used to hide in the corners of this house trying to avoid the sting of comparison. I didn't see the young woman who had sat at so many family dinners biting her tongue while Noah's triumphs were paraded like trophies. I saw a soldier, a leader, someone who had chosen her path and walked it without apology. I took a long breath and let it out slowly. Tomorrow, I would wear this uniform not as an armor to deflect their doubts, but as a simple truth of who I had become. I would not argue. I would not defend. I would simply stand. As I turned down the covers and prepared for bed, I felt a quiet resolve settle over me. Outside, the night was as silent as the thoughts in my head. In this house, I might always be the one measured against my brother's bright light, but in the world beyond these walls, I knew exactly who I was. And that was more than enough. Tomorrow, I would let them see it too. Morning came softly wrapped in the damp hush of an Oregon fog that clung to the ground and muted every sound. I woke before the alarm could chime, my body already attuned to the day ahead. The house was still and quiet. As I rose from bed, the familiar creak of the floorboards beneath my feet, a small comfort in the silence. I dressed with care, each movement deliberate, each button of my uniform shining beneath my fingertips. The mirror reflected back a woman composed and certain, every line of the midnight blue jacket precise, every insignia in place. It was more than just habit. It was the armor I had earned, the outward sign of years of steady resolve. When I was finished, I took a final look at myself. My posture was straight, shoulders back, chin lifted, not out of pride, but out of a simple acceptance of who I was. Downstairs, the house was still steeped in sleep. I moved quietly, gathering my overnight bag and slipping out the front door before anyone could stir. The air was brisk, the taste of pine sharp on my tongue. My breath rose in white clouds as I made my way to my car, the gravel crunching softly under my boots. The drive to Pinnacle Core Technologies was short, a winding path that cut through the thick stands of Douglas fir that had watched over this place since before I was born. As the building came into view, the sun was only a faint glow behind the fog. Pinnacle's headquarters loomed a sleek tower of glass and steel that seemed to cut through the morning mist like a blade. It had always struck me as cold, a monument to ambition that felt as remote as the man who had built his career within its walls. My father. I parked in the visitor's lot, my car the only one there so early. I took a moment to center myself, resting my hands lightly on the steering wheel. Then I stepped out, the weight of my uniform settling on my shoulders like a quiet promise. Walking up the steps to the front entrance, I noticed how the fog softened the harsh lines of the building, the glass glinting softly in the dim light. The lobby was nearly empty, only a young receptionist behind the wide marble counter. She looked up as I approached, her eyes widening as they fell on the silver oak leaves at my collar. "Good morning, ma'am," she said, her voice catching for just a moment before she straightened. Professional composure slipping back into place. "Can I help you with something?" I offered, a small smile. "I'm here for the meeting with the CEO," I said simply. She nodded quickly, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "Of course, Colonel Morgan. We weren't expecting you so early, but I'll let them know you've arrived." I watched her as she worked, saw the flicker of curiosity in her eyes. It wasn't lost on me that she hadn't been told I would be here in person. That was part of the plan, part of the quiet power that came from not needing to announce yourself ahead of time. I waited near the glass doors, my eyes taking in the bright lobby with its minimalist art and gleaming floors. It all felt so carefully curated, so precisely managed. Just like the way my father liked to run his life. Just like the way he had always tried to run mine. Voices echoed from the hallway beyond the reception desk. I turned my head just in time to see my father and Noah emerging from a side corridor deep in conversation. My father's brow was furrowed, his hand gesturing as he spoke. Noah walked beside him, his expression serious, his crisp business attire impeccable as always. They hadn't seen me yet. I watched them for a moment, noting how at ease they looked in this place. How natural it seemed for them to walk these polished halls. Then my father's gaze shifted and landed on me. His stride didn't falter, but his eyes widened for a brief instant, a flicker of surprise he tried to mask with a quick smile. Noah looked up a heartbeat later, his own reaction muted but unmistakable. His eyes flicked from my uniform to my face, and I saw something there. A flash of uncertainty quickly hidden behind a careful nod. My father's smile didn't reach his eyes. He leaned closer to Noah, his voice pitched just low enough that he must have thought I wouldn't hear. "If you were in uniform, son," he said, a trace of humor in his tone, "you'd probably look even more impressive than your sister." Noah's lips curved into a small, almost indulgent smile. "Well, Dad," he said lightly, "I guess we'll never know, will we?" They didn't know how their words landed, how they echoed like old ghosts in my chest. I kept my face calm, my expression steady. Let them have their last easy joke. Let them believe just for another few minutes that this was still a game Noah would always win. Because in a few minutes everything would change. The difference between them and me wasn't just a matter of what we wore or how we carried ourselves. It was deeper than that. Rooted in years of service and the quiet certainty that comes from knowing your worth doesn't depend on anyone else's opinion. As I waited for the elevator that would take me up to the executive floor, I let the cold steel of the uniform buttons ground me. I wasn't here to be compared to anyone. I wasn't here to prove anything to them. I was here to do my job, to stand in my own light, and to let them see, clearly finally, that I had never needed their validation to begin with. The doors to the executive conference room were already open when I arrived, a wide glass threshold that looked out over the company's carefully manicured campus. The morning fog was starting to burn away, leaving behind streaks of pale blue sky that felt almost symbolic. Inside the room was sleek and modern. Clean lines, polished wood, a long table that gleamed beneath the recessed lighting. A screen at the far end displayed the Pinnacle Core Technologies logo, crisp and cold. Noah and my father were already seated deep in quiet conversation. Noah looked as if he owned the room. His posture relaxed, a small smile playing at the edges of his mouth. My father sat beside him, scanning a stack of papers, his brow furrowed in concentration. I stepped inside my uniform jacket, perfectly pressed, the silver oak leaves on my collar catching the light. Neither of them looked up right away. In that moment, I saw how completely they believed they belonged here, how completely they believed I did not. My father's eyes finally lifted, and he gave me a nod, polite but distant. Noah's gaze flickered over me and then away again, as though I were no more than a quiet observer, a minor character in the larger story he was telling. I took my seat at the far end of the table, laying a slim folder in front of me, my movements measured and deliberate. The room began to fill with other executives, men and women in tailored suits, some of them exchanging quick handshakes with Noah, all of them taking their seats without a second glance in my direction. I didn't mind. I wasn't here to be seen by them. The door at the far end opened once more, and the room fell into an expectant hush. Charlotte Grant stepped inside, and the shift in the room was instant. She had a presence that couldn't be ignored. Calm assured her gaze, sweeping the table with quiet authority. She was dressed in a simple navy blazer, her hair pulled back in a sleek twist. I watched her for a moment, remembering the first time I'd met her in Washington, how she had looked me in the eye and spoken to me like an equal, not as an afterthought. She crossed the room slowly, her heels silent on the thick carpet. As she drew closer, the conversations around me stuttered, and then died away altogether. Noah's smile faltered just slightly. My father shifted in his seat, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. Charlotte stopped in front of me, her expression softening into a small, genuine smile. "Ma'am," she said clearly, her voice ringing out in the sudden quiet. "Your presence is a privilege. We're honored to have you here today." For a heartbeat, the room was absolutely still. I could feel every pair of eyes turning toward me, the weight of their sudden startled attention pressing in like a held breath. I let that moment stretch, meeting Charlotte's gaze with steady calm. "I'm here," I said, my voice level and sure to ensure the integrity of the national security contract. The words landed in the room with a quiet finality. I didn't have to raise my voice or add anything more. It was enough. Noah was staring at me now, his eyes wide, the easy confidence slipping just a little. My father's mouth opened slightly as if to speak, but no words came out. In that instant, I saw it all. The unspoken calculations, the careful illusions they had wrapped around themselves for so long. And I saw how with one sentence those illusions had begun to crack. There was no more room left for comparisons, no more room to wonder how Noah might have done it better if he'd chosen my path. Because now they understood. This wasn't about titles or theories. This was about lived experience, about choices made and paid for, about the years I'd spent in places they'd never even imagined. Charlotte nodded once, a small gesture of respect, and then turned to address the rest of the room. Her words flowed easily, outlining the agenda for the meeting, but I barely heard them. I sat very still, feeling the shift in the air around me like the slow turning of a tide. I wasn't here as anyone's daughter or sister. I wasn't here as the girl who used to sit at family dinners polite and invisible. I was here because I had earned my place, because I had done the work no one else could see, because I had never needed to be compared to anyone to know exactly who I was. As Charlotte began the meeting, I let my gaze move around the table, seeing the new awareness in their eyes. Some of them looked away quickly. Others held my gaze a little longer, as if trying to reconcile this quiet woman in uniform with whatever story they'd been told. It didn't matter. I had never needed them to understand. I had never needed them to see me. Until now. And now they couldn't look away. I sat at the long conference table, my uniform as much a part of me as the calm resolve I carried in my chest. Charlotte Grant had taken her place at the head of the table, her presence as steady and unshakable as always. To her left, I sat with my back straight, my eyes clear. I felt the weight of every gaze in that room turn toward me, but I didn't flinch. This wasn't a room I had grown up in, but it might as well have been. The quiet hierarchies, the subtle ways power shifted with every word and gesture. It was a language I had learned through years of service, a language that Noah and my father had never needed to understand. I listened as the meeting began, Charlotte outlining the key points of the project with precise clarity. Her voice filled the room, authoritative and calm. When she paused to invite updates, heads turned in my direction, almost in unison. I could feel the weight of that moment. The first time any of them had been asked to see me, not as a visitor or a quiet observer, but as the expert I was. I didn't hesitate. My first question was about the technical integration of their proposed system with existing defense infrastructure, how they plan to address the risk of redundancy failures, and maintain operational continuity in the event of a breach. My words were measured and direct, the tone of someone used to speaking in briefings, where every word mattered. The project manager at the far end of the table blinked, taken aback by the depth of my question. I could see the shift in his posture as he scrambled to find the right response. Noah's face tightened slightly in the corner of my vision, his confident ease slipping just a little. My father sat rigid in his chair, his knuckles white where they gripped his pen. I offered no smile, no apology for the precision of my questions. I simply waited listening as the manager offered a stumbling explanation that didn't quite cover the gaps I had pointed out. I nodded once when he finished and turned to the next point, building on my questions with a quiet certainty that left no room for doubt. I wasn't here to show off. I wasn't here to remind them of what they had never cared to see. I was here because this work mattered, because the security of this project reached beyond any one person's ambition or pride. Charlotte watched me with a calm attentiveness, a faint smile at the corners of her mouth. When I finished my line of questioning, she turned back to the table, her voice steady. "Colonel Morgan's expertise," she said, "is what will determine the future of this project." The words landed like a quiet thunderclap in the room. I saw Noah's jaw tighten, the fleeting uncertainty in his eyes as he looked at me, not as his sister, but as the person whose judgment would shape everything they were trying to build. My father looked down at the table, his expression unreadable. It was the first time I had ever heard my title spoken aloud in their presence with that kind of respect. Not a line in a polite introduction, not a half-hearted nod to something they couldn't quite understand, but an acknowledgement of authority, of earned trust. I didn't let the satisfaction show on my face. I didn't need to. This moment wasn't about vindication or revenge. It was about the simple truth of standing in the space I had carved out for myself, the space I no longer needed anyone's permission to claim. The conversation moved on, but I could feel the subtle shift in the room, like the slow turning of the tide. The executives around me stopped addressing their updates to Charlotte alone. They turned to me, waiting for my nod or my question, seeing in me not the quiet daughter who had sat at their dinner table for years, but the officer who had spent a lifetime in quiet service. I spoke when I needed to, brief, clear, without flourish. When there were gaps in their plans, I pointed them out. When their assumptions were sound, I said so. There was no need to prove anything. My work spoke for me. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught Noah watching me. His expression caught between confusion and reluctant respect. My father shifted again, but he said nothing. For once, he didn't have to. When the meeting drew to a close, Charlotte stood and offered me a nod, a small gesture that carried more weight than any of the grand speeches my family had ever made. "Thank you, Colonel," she said simply. I inclined my head, my response just as quiet. "My pleasure, ma'am." The room began to empty, the chatter of executives already turning to next steps and action items. But I stayed seated for a moment longer, letting the silence settle around me. In that stillness, I felt a quiet peace, an understanding that went deeper than words. This was what it meant to be seen not as an extension of someone else's dreams, not as a footnote in someone else's story, but as myself. And in that moment, I knew that was enough. The conference room had long since emptied, the hum of conversation and the scrape of chairs fading into the soft hush of a building settling back into itself. I lingered by the window for a moment, watching the morning light break through the last of the fog. It felt like standing on the edge of something both familiar and entirely new. I turned at the quiet click of the door. My father stood there, his expression unreadable, a man who'd built his life on certainty, now searching for words. He closed the door behind him, the soft thud of it echoing in the stillness between us. He didn't speak right away. I could see the struggle in the lines around his mouth, the weight of years spent seeing only what he wanted to see. Finally, he met my eyes. "You surprised me today," he said, his voice rough. I didn't know you'd gone this far." I held his gaze, my own steady calm. "I didn't need you to know, Dad," I said quietly. "I just needed you to see." He swallowed, his shoulders shifting under the weight of that truth. "I see now," he said, his voice low. "I see you." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't the sweeping confession of regret I might have wished for years ago. But it was enough. An acknowledgement that for the first time he was looking at me not as the daughter who'd chosen the wrong path, but as the woman who'd made her own. I gave him a small smile, letting the silence say what didn't need to be spoken. Noah stepped in then, hesitating just inside the door. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by a kind of uncertain humility that I had never seen in him before. He looked at me then, at our father, as if trying to decide where he fit in this moment. I thought he said, finally, his voice careful. I thought that if I'd chosen the military, if I'd walked that path, I would have done it better than you. He let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh, but there was no humor in it. I see now that I was wrong. I studied him, my older brother, who had always been so sure of himself, so quick to assume that his success was a measure of what I hadn't achieved. It's not about better, Noah, I said softly. It never was. I'm not better than you. I just chose a different way. He nodded, the smallest movement, but I saw the shift in his shoulders, the way his jaw relaxed. I know, he said. I know that now. For a long moment, none of us spoke. The air between us felt fragile, like the pause after a long breath. Still uncertain, but no longer heavy with the weight of all the things we'd left unsaid for so long. I didn't need them to apologize. I didn't need them to understand every choice I had made or every moment I had spent earning the rank on my collar. I only needed them to see me, to accept that I wasn't defined by their expectations or by the roles they had assigned me so long ago. In that quiet room, I felt the last of the old tension ease from my shoulders. The comparison that had once felt like a wound now felt like an echo fading into the past. I wasn't standing in Noah's shadow, and he wasn't standing in mine. We were simply two people who had chosen different paths, each with their own weight, each with their own worth. My father looked at me, his eyes tired but clear. "You did good, Harper." He said the words simple, but carrying more weight than any apology could have. I nodded, my smile small but real. "Thank you," I said. Noah shifted his hands in his pockets. I guess we both learned something today." Maybe I said, "Maybe that's enough." The three of us stood there a moment longer, the sunlight warming the glass, the air between us finally open. I didn't know what the future would look like, or how long this fragile understanding would last. But in that moment, I felt a quiet peace settle over me. I didn't need more. I didn't need their pride or their praise. I had found something stronger in myself, a steady certainty that didn't rely on anyone else's measure. As we turned to leave the room, I felt lighter than I had in years. The echoes of old comparisons, old doubts were still there, but they no longer held power over me. I walked out of that room not as the daughter who was always second best, but as the woman who had chosen her own path, and who was finally seen for who she was. That evening, I eased the car onto the highway that would carry me back to Washington, D.C. The cool night air felt crisp against my skin as I cracked the window just enough to catch the scent of pine and earth one last time before leaving it behind. The road stretched out in front of me like a silver ribbon under the low moonlight, and for the first time in years, I felt completely at peace behind the wheel. I drove in silence, letting the steady hum of the tires on the pavement settle my thoughts. In the quiet of the car, there was no need for words or explanations. There was just the soft rhythm of the highway and the sure knowledge that I was heading back to a life I had built entirely on my own terms. A life I no longer needed to justify to anyone. I thought back to the conversations of the day, the quiet shock in my father's voice, the hesitant admission in Noah's eyes. They had seen me in a new light, and for the first time I had let them. But what mattered most was how I had seen myself. In that moment, seated at the head of that table, every eye turned toward me. I had felt something click into place, deep in my chest. It was a kind of freedom I hadn't known I'd been missing. I remembered the way Charlotte had spoken my name. Calm, certain, not as an afterthought, but as a fact. "Ma'am, your presence is a privilege." The words had settled around me like a quiet benediction, echoing not just in that glass-walled room, but in the small, forgotten spaces of my own heart. It was more than respect. It was recognition, clear and unwavering. For so long, I'd measured my worth in the small silences of family dinners, in the polite nods of people who never really saw me. I'd let their assumptions become the backdrop of my own story, never realizing how much space they had claimed in my mind. But tonight the echoes of those old doubts felt like ghosts in the rearview mirror. Present but powerless, I glanced at my reflection in the side window, the faint outline of my uniform still visible even in the darkness. The silver oak leaves glinted softly, a quiet reminder of the path I had chosen, of the battles I had fought both seen and unseen. It wasn't about rank or titles anymore. It was about the woman I had become on the way to earning them. The woman who had stopped asking for permission and started living by her own measures. Outside, the world rolled by in hushed waves of forest and highway. Small towns blinked sleepily in the distance, their lights like tiny constellations along the roadside. I passed them without slowing down my focus on the horizon ahead, on the promise of home, of something settled and sure. I let my thoughts drift, remembering the small details of the day, the way the conference room had fallen silent when I spoke, the flicker of uncertainty in Noah's smile, the slow dawning of understanding in my father's eyes. For so long I had wanted them to see me, and now they had. But I realized that the real victory wasn't in their changed expressions or the weight of their surprise. The real victory was the quiet certainty that settled in my chest, that whispered in the spaces between each breath I was enough. I had always been enough. I didn't need their apologies or their approval. I didn't need to prove anything anymore. My worth had never been up for debate, no matter how many times I had let their comparisons shape the edges of my confidence. Tonight, I had finally laid that old story to rest. "You don't need to shout to be seen," I whispered into the dark, my voice barely more than a breath. "When you believe in yourself, your worth speaks for you." The words felt true in a way they never had before, more than a mantra, more than a hope. They felt like a promise I had made to myself, one I intended to keep no matter where the road ahead led me. The miles unspooled beneath my tires, the glow of the dashboard lights soft and steady in the quiet cabin. I thought of the house I was driving toward, the small apartment in DRC, that had become my own quiet refuge. I thought of the morning light that would fill the rooms when I arrived, the coffee I would brew in the calm of my own kitchen. For the first time in years, the idea of coming home felt like a return to something real, something I had claimed for myself beyond the reach of old expectations and half-remembered slights. A single trip, a single dinner, a single word spoken with quiet certainty. "Ma'am." It had been enough to shift everything. Not just in the boardroom, but in the quietest chambers of my own heart. It had been enough to remind me that the truest power lies in knowing who you are, even when no one else does. As the night deepened, I felt a smile curve across my lips, small and certain. The world outside the windshield was wide and open, and I was ready for it. I was ready to live without the weight of comparison, without the quiet ache of wanting to be seen. I was ready to live in the quiet power of my own voice, my own choices. One trip, one dinner, one word, and it was enough. I drove on through the darkness, the road a quiet companion to my thoughts. The woman in the driver's seat was no longer the girl who had once measured her worth against her brother's easy charm or her father's careful pride. She was her own measure now, her own light in the dark. And in that truth I found a peace I had never known before. I was alone, but I was not lonely. I was quiet, but I was not small, and I was exactly where I was meant to be. Have you ever felt like you were living in someone else's shadow? Like your story didn't matter as much as theirs, even when you knew deep down it did? Have you ever held your breath waiting for someone to finally see you for who you really are? I'd love to hear your stories. What was the moment you realized you didn't need anyone else's validation to know your worth? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Awesome. I read everyone, and I'd love to create a space here for all of us to be seen together. If this story resonated with you, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you'll never miss another journey of strength and quiet triumph. I have so many more stories to share, and I'd be honored to have you with me on every step of the way.